Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining me for the Garbage In, Garbage Out webcast on how ETL can transform your healthcare BI program. This is Laura Madsen, Healthcare Practice Leader at Lancet Software. Just a couple of housekeeping items for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and enter them right into the question pane on your screen there. And if you have any other questions or concerns, you can always enter content there as well. Things like, I can't hear you, or please stop talking. That's a joke. So feel free to enter that into the panel there. Today we're going to talk about extract, transform, and load. It's the second in 4 series about the key important things associated with healthcare BI programs. The first one you can listen to on our website at any time under the Resource Center, and that is the current state of BI programs. And next month we'll be doing a webinar on data modeling for healthcare BI. And finally in November we will be addressing BI programs, the checklist for healthcare BI programs in November. And you can find all of that information on our website, lancetsoftware.com. But today we're going to talk about ETL. And you may wonder why I selected ETL to be a topic of its own. And the primary reason why is sort of twofold. It usually ends up being about 80% of any given project as far as time. And it also tends to introduce the most risk in any BI program, but particularly for healthcare, because there's so many things that you have to do to transform the data to make it usable. So we really felt strongly that ETL was an important aspect of healthcare BI and needed to have its own webinar. So here we are today. So today I'm going to cover what ETL is really, this concept of extract, transform, and load, or often referred to as data integration. We're going to talk about why it's so important for healthcare in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about the current state of ETL, although I don't know that that's really critical. Then I'm going to talk about the 10 best practices for ETL, and then I already talked about the series a little bit, but at the end here we'll talk about the next in the series. So why is ETL so important for healthcare? And we all sort of have to agree that that data is flawed by design, because data is primarily created by people. Sometimes you get machines or automated things that create data, but for the most part, somebody even created that system to create that data. So there's almost always people involved with the creation of the data, and of course that introduces the opportunity for risk or for error, for lack of quality in that data. So there's almost always an issue with the data itself as far as the quality of that data. But more importantly for healthcare in particular is the need for data to be fully integrated to be really usable to your average end user. So if you look at a series of claim lines for one hospital stay, depending on what was involved in that hospital stay, that claim line can be hundreds and hundreds of rows of data. And if you're not an analyst that is keenly aware of how to bring all that data together, aggregate that data, and get the information out of that data, you're kind of going to get confused. And most people aren't analysts. Most people aren't that high quality analyst that has the capability of being able to put all of those hundreds of rows of encounter data together to be able to get that information out. So ETL has the ability to do that. It can take those hundreds of rows of encounter information and turn it into one piece of information for our end users to be able to consume. And that's probably the most important thing about ETL for healthcare BI, is that it's absolutely critical for our data to be integrated in order for it to be usable. So data is flawed, but also mainly it's just messy and not useful in its raw form. So we have to find a way to bring it together so that people can use it. So what is ETL really? And in this construct, ETL is really the application of a business rule to all data. And a business rule can be anything. If you remember word problems when you were a kid, it's very similar to word problems in that we can tell our ETL developers that anytime an encounter comes in with this series of codes, that means that that is flagged as a diabetic member, or an admission from our emergency department, or any other combination of things you could think of. So these business rules have to come from the business and be applied to the data, and that's where ETL and business have to really work together to define those business rules based on the data itself and how business needs to consume it. So when we talk about ETL, all we're really talking about is applying these business rules to the data so that people can actually use that. So here's an important point when we're talking about bringing data over from source systems. There is so much data everywhere in every one of our systems, and now with the push of electronic health records, we have even more data. So there's data everywhere, but not a drop of knowledge. So just because you can bring data over doesn't mean you should. So remember that when you bring data over, you want to make sure that that data has a use. That somebody needs it for analysis, or that you know that there's a potential for somebody needing it for analysis at some point down the road. So just because you can doesn't mean you should when you're thinking about pulling data over. Also keep in mind that data needs change over time. So you can bring a whole bunch of data over and create a whole series of static reports, but you probably still have a group of people that have data needs that change pretty dramatically and change within weeks or months. So that generally happens with a team of analysts, which is generally a small percentage of your end users, but those people are often the people that from an IT perspective can be a real challenge to work with because they have so many needs. In ETL best practices, and we'll go through those, there's a method in how we get that data over to a data warehouse, and we're very systematic about it for a reason. But these analysts, if we're really systematic about bringing the data in all the time, we slow them way down. So one of the ways we can get around that is to create an analytic sandbox for them and let them do sort of their own ETL, although it's not really ETL, it's more dump and load. But if we just let them bring all of the data over that they need, and it's their own sandbox that they're responsible for managing, that not only takes the load off of us, but it also protects our system so that we can continue to practice all of the good practices that we have on the ETL side, but enables them to get the work done that they need to get done. So that's a couple of things that I recommend when we talk about ETL and ETL processes. Very important here when we are talking about structuring our ETL scripts or an ETL program or maybe an ETL team for the first time. Even in ETL, you want to focus on the value of the data. And I said this earlier, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But if you always keep your eye on what I term the value ball, you're going to be better off. So, in other words, this is an opportunity for you to really think about and apply what the data is in the context of how the business works. So, in other words, can the business, or how does the business, or how will the business use these data? And always asking the business what's impactful for them, what's important for them 6 months or a year from now. So you're always keeping your eye on the value ball. The further away you get from thinking about the business and just bringing data over, the better shot you're going to be at missing that value ball. And at some point or another, somebody's going to start asking some questions. So make sure that you really focus a lot on anything that you do within the construct of that data warehouse, including ETL, really focuses on creating value for the end users. That's your number one job for BI programs. So now we'll talk a little bit about the best practices for ETL. And one thing I do want to say, talking about the current state of ETL, in my experience working with a lot of hospitals and payer organizations over the years, what I've seen a lot of is a sort of slow start with ETL, right? People realize that they need to move data from a source system over to a data repository, and that data repository may not always be a traditional data warehouse. And they may not have the skill set in the hospital or in the organization to be able to do traditional ETL with best practices. So what you see a lot of is the sort of what's generally referred to as dump and load, or suck and plunk. So in other words, you just grab all that data, suck it out of the source system, and throw it into this data repository. You don't worry a lot about relationships, or you don't worry a lot about the quality of data or anything else. And then once you get in the repository, you try to figure out what's what. And generally what happens in those scenarios is it really requires a lot of expertise of a person interacting with that data to make it usable. And all that really equates to is the lack of end user satisfaction, because they don't have exposure to the data. So these ETL best practices really formalize the method of getting data out from your transactional systems and into your data warehouse. So with that in mind, that's what these best practices were really created around, is this idea of formally and with very methodically getting data out and putting it in. So the first best practice for ETL in healthcare BI is to create your own development lifecycle. Of course, this should say SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle, but the idea here is the same. In any ETL script that you build, you want to do the work of designing it, then developing it, testing it, deploying it, and I'm sorry, I should have started with analyze, and then go through that circle again, okay? So the first thing you do is analyze the data. The next thing you do is design that script so that it works the way that you think it should. You develop the script, you actually write the code, you test it out, then you deploy it, and then you start all over again. Each time you create a script, and using this repeatable process means that it makes it a lot easier for you to create ETL scripts over time. By always starting with this concept of analysis and design. Now, I've worked with a lot of ETL organizations, and often what I see skipped is the analyze and then potentially even the design. I think it's dangerous to skip the analysis portion, because looking at the data that you're going to be using or pulling is really critically important, because it's easy to have data loads fail based on certain things that you didn't anticipate because you didn't analyze the data first. So you definitely want to spend some time analyzing the data. You definitely want to spend some time designing that script so that you can extract that data in the most efficient way possible. And then obviously developing and testing it is critical too. Although I can't tell you how many times I've been at an organization that skipped the test portion of this exercise because they ran out of time. And that's true sort of across the board in most projects I've seen, is that the testing is the first thing to go, or the first thing to get minimalized from a time perspective. And there's lots of reasons why, and that's probably a completely different webinar, but you really don't want to skip the testing portion unless you have a lot of money to be able to just keep doing your project over and over again, which most of us don't have. So all of these are really critically important. That's why it's called a life cycle. You can't skip any of these phases. You may be able to shorten them, but you really can't skip them. So that's our first best practice. The next best practice is what we term the data integration view, the data, this full enterprise data integration view. And the most important word there is enterprise. So in other words, as you are building this script for this one thing, you need to be able to have a bigger picture perspective of what's happening within the context of the BI program and the data warehouse. And if you don't, sometimes the lack of that big picture view will impact how you write that script, and could, in 6 months or something, or even longer down the road, put you in a situation that really impedes your progress. So it's really important to be thinking about, when you're building out an individual script, or you have a project in a larger program, it's really important to think about that project in the context of that larger program, so that you don't put yourself in a situation future facing where you sort of designed yourself into a corner here. So think about it this way: it is an enterprise perspective of the data integration view, looking at the big picture. The next best practice we're going to talk about is limiting the impact of noisy data. And noisy data is that data that we pull out of our source systems that is consistently bad and therefore noisy by this definition. So, for example, I used to work with pharmacy data, and there were fields that were required that had to be entered in based on a certain set of parameters. And those fields were always usually pretty nice. They weren't very noisy. But then there were other fields that weren't required. And so you'd get things like the pharmacist leaning over the keyboard to explain something to a patient and hitting the 9 key, and it would keep 127 nines, or how many ever characters that cell would allow. And you'd see that over and over and over again on these fields that weren't required, because it didn't matter what was actually in the field in that transactional system. That's what we generally term as noisy data, because not only is it inaccurate, so it's not reflecting what is actually should be reflected within that data point, like the example of the 127 nines, but it's almost always wrong, because the nature of that transactional system for a pharmacist is they're going to only do what's really necessary, and they're going to pay attention to the quality of the things that's really necessary, but they're probably not going to really worry about the things that they can click right through. So that is certainly an issue with this concept of noisy data. So the best thing that you can do from this perspective is data profiling and data quality. So you create rules as you bring data over that limits the noisy data as much as possible. You know in this cell that you're expecting this parameter, this range of values, and anything outside of that should be flagged. And those kinds of data quality rules that you put in as you extract the data over will really help limit the noisy data. The only way that you can really do that, though, is to do some data profiling of the source system. And so that means going in there and looking at which fields are consistently error prone. You're always seeing things that you shouldn't be seeing in there. And then you can flag those and then make sure you write data quality rules associated with those. So those are the things that we want to do in order to limit this concept of noisy data, or data that's consistently wrong. And that's back to this concept of doing data profiling and data quality. So data staging is a very popular method of definitely it's a consistent practice in ETL, something we see a lot of in traditional data warehouse architectures. When you use this data staging area, it's a temporary area where you put your data, and it mimics the source system for data controls. But the nice thing about it is it insulates the data warehouse repository from source system changes. And this staging area can also help with audit controls and recovery time if you happen to have a job failure. So you suck the data out of the source system and you put it in this staging area. The great thing about that is you're protecting your transactional systems from any performance issues while you're taking that data out. You're not always in there running down the performance of the transactional system. So you're protecting yourself from that perspective. You're also protecting your data warehouse as well from any changes that happen in that source system. You didn't just take it out of the source system and automatically put it into your data repository. So you have this area where it's protecting both ends of that continuum, and in the middle is where you can apply some of your transformations to make that data more usable, or apply some of those data quality scripts so that you can may have good quality data. So stage your data. Obviously, anytime we can reuse is a good thing. And one of the best practices for ETL is to create reusable transformations as much as possible. Now, that can be very challenging to do if you're dealing with a bunch of different source systems and a lot of business rules that change over time. It's very hard to create these reusable transformations. But it can this can be very helpful in your process. Excuse me. It will certainly save you time, money, and it will help you avoid errors. So as you're creating ETL scripts or creating your ETL program or hiring ETL developers, that kind of a thing, always think about this concept of reusable transformations. And if you write something and you can reuse it in another place, all the better. So as you're writing things, obviously be thinking about reusing that for a transformation down the road as well. So now we're going to talk about latency. And data latency is sort of a hot topic in just about every BI program that I've ever worked with. But it's a little bit different in healthcare in that data latency is a little bit error prone in itself. So this concept of data latency is how quickly you get the data from when it was actually quote unquote created, right? And one of the challenges in healthcare, of course, is that when that data is created, it's really out of context. So from a payer perspective, you can create a claim, and that original claim line has something to do with somebody visiting a doctor or going to the hospital. Well, that claim line will add, you'll probably have another 15 or 20 things, another rows of data added onto that one claim line. And then it will, have to be reversed out and then added back in. And that kind of a thing. So in the payer side, in order to get the view of a final adjudicated claim, there's a number of iterations that claim record will go through. So the idea of me taking that claim record out of the source system as soon as it's created really introduces, or could introduce, some issues with the data quality itself. So in the past, we've always sort of poo-pooed that idea, if you will, of not grabbing that data out right away. On the provider side, it's a little bit different in that, as you're entering in clinically relevant information in the source systems, getting that data out right away in the past was very challenging and sort of error prone. But now that there's so many EHRs and so many hospitals have adopted it, the idea is actually gaining a lot of momentum, because you can get that data out of one source system and share it across many different systems, again from a clinical perspective, so that as this person is leaving a procedure room, you can see the clinical notes and know that something happened or something didn't happen, probably just as important. So getting that data out of those systems at the provider level and sharing that as quickly as possible, so as little latency as conceivable, is actually a really good thing from a usability perspective of that data outside of the concept of a data warehouse. So what I generally recommend for my clients is a concept called zero latency. And what that means is that data is handed out, given up in the data warehouse as quickly as it can be created with high quality. And you have to define your quality standards, but In other words, you may not get a final adjudicated claim for 30 or 60 days, but as soon as that final adjudicated claim is ready, then it's in the data warehouse. There's no like, oh, well, the final adjudicated claim happened 3 days ago, but we only do our ETL on Thursdays, so we're going to have to wait. No, it's there as soon as it could possibly be. So that's this concept of zero latency. And that's an easy way for us to all think about how we get our data in as quickly as possible. This concept of zero latency. I had another thought there, but I forgot it. So if I think of it, I'll come back. Okay, so no question that errors happen, right? People are human, and stuff happens. Errors will happen. So it is really critical for ETL architects to have created a design that handles those errors upon initiation of that ETL job and allows for a restart automatically when errors occur. Then for continued process improvement when those errors happen, write the records that fail the business rules to a separate file for the business owners or stewards to look into them. This really should prompt a change of business rules to account for any new information and for future reprocessing. So this is a really nice way to manage errors as quickly as possible and to consistently handle them in a process-driven way. So we know that this errored out, it's going to drop into this file, and somebody will actually look at it and see if that record errored out because for some reason that record is erroneous, or there's actually a process change that's prompting that record to error out consistently. And if it's a process change, then we know we have to sort of go back to the drawing board and recreate some processes. So testing, talked a little bit about this in the beginning when we were looking at that development life cycle. And we know how critical the data in the data warehouse is, and it's really challenging to integrate data for usage. It's very challenging, and it's the idea of integrating clinical data with financial data is one that many of us have dealt with for a number of years, and the challenges associated with that are so broad-reaching that a lot of us haven't even tackled it. So what we want to be clear about is, as we are tackling these really big issues of integrating these data together, data that have never been really integrated together before, or maybe are very, very different, like clinical and financial data, it's really incredibly important, more and more important, to have robust ETL testing standards for your organization as you're creating all of these data to put into this data repository. So create a quality testing team that works alongside your ETL development team. And they should be together early on in the requirements building stage so they all hear the same things. And they can create their high-level test plan. And this is the same process that we recommend for testing if you're building out reports too, right? So it's the same process, it's just a little bit earlier in the process during this ETL phase. So what we want to do is have those quality folks listening to the requirements and building out their test plans for the ETL early on. So while you're developing your ETL scripts, the quality team is going along developing their test plan. When you deploy your ETL scripts for that first test, they test it based on those requirements, and then you can go back and tweak it based on what they find. And having that testing process really early on, starting really early on in the early phases of that, will really benefit the ETL script design very much. And then once it's tested itself, and you're putting data into the warehouse for a report developer to use, that means that report developer's testing itself, as they're testing, then they know that they can isolate any issues that they have on the report to any kind of transformations they did on the report itself, which makes testing for reports a much easier scenario. So important to be able to create test plans early on and have a quality team side by side with you. So I'm not an ETL developer, but I can tell you that a lot of the tools that are out there are pretty sophisticated, and they can do a lot of things, and they vary a great deal. So it's really important to understand the tool that you're using and all of its capabilities. I think what happens a lot of the time is that ETL developers, just like most of us, get used to a tool and use it one way, and they don't always realize that there are other capabilities or broader capabilities that the product can bring to bear. So it's a good idea to take advantage of some of the training that is offered for the ETL tool and look at other capabilities that the tool can offer your program, because you may find that there are things that it can do that will solve an issue for you. So it's important to be able to do that to be successful in your both your design as well as your deployment of your scripts. So constantly look for training opportunities for your ETL team. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about compliance requirements. Now, this, when I was thinking about how to present this idea, I thought, well, aren't we all sort of taming the lion of compliance requirements today? And it feels like that's all we do. Is there's a new requirement that we have to comply with, and now we're trying to figure out how to do that. And in healthcare, it can be incredibly overwhelming to think of all the compliance requirements that you have and how you're supposed to keep up with all of that. It's very, very difficult. Healthcare definitely has some of the most stringent regulations of any industry. So you have to keep in mind that any proposed ETL solution must plan for all of those compliance requirements. And we're talking both state and federal regulations. So using some of these industry best practices, standards, and guidelines will certainly help you. Ensure that you have a method for audit controls. And when I think about audit controls for healthcare, one of the key things that I recommend is actually a separate audit control environment within your data warehousing architecture. And I think I talk about that in the first webinar a little bit, recommended data warehousing architecture for healthcare BI programs. But it's really important to have a whole separate audit control environment where you can go back to and look at that data at its source, how it was originally created, any application of scripts that have transformed that data, and then the final result of that data, because that's what auditors will look for. So important things from a compliance requirements perspective, and we're not going to talk specifically about any given compliance requirements depending on, HIPAA and HEDIS and the new meaningful use and all the High-Tech Act stuff for ACOs that's happening. We're not going to talk about any of that specifically, but a lot of the best practices that we've talked about so far today will help address some of these. So you have an audit control environment in your data warehouse. You have a standard repeatable process, a development lifecycle for all of your ETL scripts and how you create them. You have data profiling and data quality standards that you use in here, that you apply each time you start a new ETL project. Looking through my notes here. You use a data staging area that protects both your transactional system as well as your data warehouse systems from any kind of changes. So using all of those things will certainly help from a compliance requirements perspective. Another thing that helps that we haven't really specifically talked about, and nobody likes to, is this idea of actually documenting what you're doing, stopping and writing it down. And it does help, and it should be considered a best practice to document as much as possible. I know you have the code documented, the ETL script itself documented, but you really should have good solid requirements that code was developed from. And that will also help any kind of auditors be able to ascertain how things happened and where things are going. So that's a lot in a half an hour. So in review, just real high level, create a development lifecycle for ETL. And that development life cycle, the analyze, design, develop, deploy, or test and deploy, will help you have a repeatable process of creating this content. Always ensure that you have an enterprise view of data, and that's very important as you have this big picture perspective and you can fit your one piece of that puzzle into this big picture perspective. Make sure that any ETL scripts that you do enable the data quality and data profiling perspectives that the business has required. So you do the data profiling first, and then you apply some of these data quality standards as you extract that data over, transform it, and load it into the data warehouse. While you're doing that, the ETL work, the extracting, transforming, and loading, make sure that you have a data staging layer that buffers both systems from exposure. Create reusable ETL objects as much as possible. Recommend this concept of zero latency. I recommend this concept of zero latency, this idea that you give the data as quickly as possible to deliver a high quality product. Gracefully manage your ETL errors by putting them into a separate file when they error out, and have somebody whose job it is to look at those and see if there's any systematic process changes that have impacted the data, or if it really is just an erroneous record. If there's a systematic process issue, then you go back to the drawing board and see if there's a way that you can clean that up. Testing for ETL is very, very important. Make sure you have a quality testing team sort of side by side with you, hearing the requirements, building out their test plan, and testing those ETL scripts for you, and the fruit of the labor, if you will, the data that comes out of those ETL scripts is important. Of what they should be testing that to make sure it meets the needs. Make sure you have a good solid training program in place for your ETL developers on your ETL tool that you're using on your organization. ETL tools change, software upgrades happen. Sometimes we just get used to doing it one way, and there's a better way to do it. So make sure that you have that all of your team is empowered with the full capabilities of the ETL tool that you're using. And finally, ETL can help you meet some of these compliance requirements by having this audit control environment and documenting those ETL scripts as well as the requirements into that audit control environment. That will help you meet any compliance requirements, because we all know that we're going to have to deal with them. Okay, I think we got a couple of questions here. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in here, and I'll get started on the ones that we have. Okay, so somebody asked, I think I mentioned the ETL architect as a role. So there's a question, what's the difference between an ETL architect versus an ETL developer? It's a good question, and I've actually worked in a number of organizations that didn't have an ETL architect, just had an ETL developer. But the ETL architect's role is just like it sounds, it's to architect, just like a data architect would. So if you don't have a person thinking about the big picture all the time, so a best practice is to make sure that your ETL developers have this enterprise view. But an ETL architect, that's their job, is to understand the view, the broad scale view, and what the BI program wants to achieve, and how the data warehouse can help them get there. So that ETL architect is that broader perspective of the enterprise view of what's happening. And the skill set's a little bit different. They usually have a lot of experience in ETL, writing ETL, so they've been an ETL developer for a long time. But generally they have a very good business relationship and business knowledge in the industry, so they're able to talk with business folks about what's happening and how things can change or improve, that kind of a thing. So an ETL architect is really good to have on your side. If you get a bad ETL process and something fails and then data's delayed, that person can really be your lifesaver. Okay, here you mentioned that ETL is the riskiest part of the project, and what can we do to best manage the risk? That's a good question. I think I mentioned it right off the top that it takes the most time and it's the riskiest portion of any data warehousing project. I think managing the risk really comes down to, and certainly following these best practices is always a good thing, relying on your project manager to help you identify those risks and mitigate them as much as possible. Like I said, data is messy, and we have to transform healthcare data a lot in order for it to be usable. So we can anticipate that we're going to trip on something. We won't be able to. Find something that we should have found, or somebody's going to find something that we should have found, which is often the case. So the best way to mitigate that is to just be thoughtful about your approach. Profile the data as much as possible so you know what you're going to be dealing with. Document and mitigate any errors, and really have an ETL architect on your side that has a broader, bigger picture view, as well as having a fair amount of experience in ETL. So then must be the same person. Why does ETL take so much time? You mentioned it's 80%. Is that standard? Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard 60 to 80% of any given project is ETL. Split the difference and call it 70. That's where the majority of the work is. Once you serve up the data in the warehouse into a good data model with relational tables and all that, or dimensional tables, whichever line you stand on that, you can create a lot of reports pretty easily, right? That part is quick now. It wasn't quick 10 years ago, but it's quick now. So getting that data in is the key, and it's the most difficult part. Not only is it difficult just getting it in, it's really difficult getting it out. So our systems, our healthcare source systems, are really messy. They're messy because they need to be good on the transactional side. We need to be able to have nurses and physicians interact with these systems. So we don't care how the data looks on the back end. What we really care is the workflow and the process flow of the front end transactional system. But that has some really big downstream impacts to getting that data back out. And then, of course, you're dealing with EHR systems that are built on, old school things like MUMPs, which is this black box thing, and it's really hard to get data out of there. So you're dealing with all of those kinds of aspects of getting the data out of the systems themselves. And you look at the data itself, which is built by humans that don't really want to be building data. There's a lot of data quality issues. We have a hard time finding, an individual record of a member and finding who this patient is and consistently identifying the patient and uniquely identifying the patient. So, if you guys are listening to this webinar, you probably know that ETL is just a lot of work. And those are the reasons why it ends up being about, 80% of the time of any given project. There's not much you can do about that. It just is what it is. I think the most important thing you can do about that is to let people know that that this part is the part that takes the most time, and we don't want to cheat anybody out of that, because it's critical that we get the data in and we get it in correctly. All right, so I just have one last question here. How can I help my ETL developers work closer with my business team? Boy, if I knew the answer to that, I probably could retire. You know what? I think it's challenging, no question, and it's not because both parties don't want to work together per se. I think it just has a lot to do with we use different languages. ETL developers use a different language than business people do. But it's true that because you have to define all these business rules that end up being ETL scripts, it is helpful to have business people and ETL developers be able to have a conversation. So I guess in my experience, when I've done this in the past, I've been really careful about who I hire, and know that there's at least one or two people on my ETL team that have a fair amount of industry knowledge and can speak layman's terms from a business user's perspective, and have that capability to just interact with the business a little bit easier. So I try to hire people like that. And again, it goes back to that concept of an ETL architect. That person usually has that ability to be able to converse with your business. It's not a bad idea to find a business user that's a little bit more technically savvy too, and sort of bring it halfway, bring Muhammad to the mountain, so to speak. So, one of those groups of people has to be either business savvy or technical savvy to close the gap, because it's really the issue is that they talk very different terms, very different languages, and that's where the gap comes in. So if you can bridge that gap with somebody that's very business savvy or technical savvy, that will help a lot. You'll end up relying on that person quite a bit. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming through, so that is the end of our webinar. I'd like to mention that we have the Healthcare Business Intelligence Summit coming up Wednesday, October 12th, and at the McNamara Center at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It is a one-day educational event for organizations that are attempting to do business intelligence in healthcare. And if you want to check out the website, you can go to healthcarebisummit.com, and it's free to register if you are working in a payer or provider or any other healthcare industry. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next time for data modeling for healthcare BI programs.